volatility, for example. We looked at, for example, what it means um, uh, to have a a system which has, for example, a sequential access versus direct access versus random access. Um, what is throughput? These are all the different types of things that we were talking about last time. However, we didn't really discuss, or we sort of brushed up really and truly, but we haven't really discussed how certain devices actually work. And today we're going to be looking at how certain storage devices actually work. In fact, we're going to be looking at three different types of storage devices. We're going to be looking at magnetic devices, optical devices, as well as electronics devices. So we're particularly going to be focusing ourselves on the hard disk, optical drives, meaning anything, meaning CD, DVD, Blu-ray, what have you. They relatively use the same technology throughout. And when we talk about electronic devices, we're particularly going to be talking about SSDs or flash memory, such as SD cards, pen drives, and so on and so forth. All right, so we're going to be again going through an overview as to how these devices work. So let's start off by stating the bleeding obvious. When we talk about a magnetic storage device, essentially data within those devices are actually stored magnetically. So different polarities, all right, in a magnetic material will allow you to store the ones and zeros that you would require for your data. Optical storage really and truly stores data by altering the optical properties of a medium. All right, what do we mean by that? Be it reflected versus non-reflective, or reflective at a different angle sometimes. All right. You also have what is known as electronic storage, essentially, where you're storing data via some form of charge. All right. We'll get into those in a moment. But let's start off with magnetic storage. And particularly, we're going to be looking at the hard disk. All right. The normal hard disk that you probably all have within your own computer. All right. So the hard disk is made up of a number of different components. All right. So essentially, a hard disk is made up of magnetic disks. All right, known as platters. All right, which would have a magnetic coating on each surface of the platter. So one on top, one on the bottom. All right, for each and every disk that you might have within your hard disk. Now, it doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to have one. You might have multiple. So you might have multiple platters within the same hard disk. For each surface, you're going to have a read and write head. Okay? Now, each read and write head, all right, is going to be in relatively the same position for each and every platter, because they're all connected to one central arm, or a spin, or rather the arm mechanism. All right, all of these platters rotate around the central spindle. All right, the discs turn. All right, the arm swings in and out, and it will be able to access different areas on the magnetic surface. Essentially, when the read write head is over the desired track, as we're going to be seeing in a moment. Essentially, what happens is that you would be able to read or write information from or to that particular location on the hard drive. All right. So, if we had to sort of like break it down in terms of a diagram, probably you'd see something like this. So you have your central spindle over here, okay, where each and every one of your platters is placed upon. All right. Notice that each platter has its own magnetic surface. All right, from the top as well as the bottom. Okay. You have your arm assembly. All right, whereby you have a number of read-write heads for the top and for the bottom surface of each platter. All right, they are all placed relatively on top of each other. Therefore, whenever this arm assembly moves, all of the heads move in tandem. Okay. Essentially, when your hard disk heads happen to be over a particular track, they're over the same track over each and every one of the platters, and that is known as a cylinder. For the simple reason that essentially what you're doing is you're able to access that cylinder worth of data, if you will. A track is nothing but a circular path upon the surface, all right, and each track in turn is then split up into a number of sectors where you're actually going to be placing or writing your data. All right. Now the sector is basically going to determine the minimum amount of data that you're actually going to be able to write to um, um, to your hard drive. All right. You cannot use part of a sector for one file and then that another part of that same sector for another file. All right, you are always going to use an integer number of sectors for each and every individual file that you're going to have on your hard disk. All right. So far, so good.
Yeah. Okay.
All right. So, so essentially, if we actually had to look at an actual an actual device, okay, over here you'd see your spindle, all right, surrounded by these bearings, and over here you'd have your platters, all right. As you can see, this hard disk has 3 platters. It could be more, all right, or it could be less. It doesn't. It's not a fixed number, okay. Probably hard disks with higher storage capacities, right, would have more disks, but then they might be a bit more fragile depending on their build. Okay, usually they might be a bit slower in terms of their rotation speed. So each surface is magnetic, as you can see. The disk will rotate around the central spindle, and the read-write head, all right, it will sort of move in a sort of arcing motion, all right, in order to be able to access each and every part of the hard drive. Okay. Now it's very important, obviously, that the head of the hard drive does not actually touch the physical surface of the hard disk. All right. If you can imagine, these hard drives usually tends to spin at anything around 5,400 revolutions per minute. All right, up to normal operation speeds of 7,200 revolutions per minute. If you have actual hyper drives, all right, drives which actually spin a lot faster, you can even go all the way up to 12,000 revolutions per minute, essentially. So you can imagine the amount of damage that could actually occur on the surface of these platters if the head actually had to touch the surface. They, in fact, only hover just slightly above the surface in each direction. All right. Obviously, if the read-write head is above the platter, it is just slightly above it. If it's below the platter, it's just slightly below it. But the distance between the surface of the hard disk and the read-write head is so small, okay, that that if you actually had to compare it in relation to a human hair, all right, then probably the distance, if you had to blow it up, the distance would be something like that. Whereas a human hair would look like something the size of a football. All right, if we're talking about proportional scale. That is one of the reasons why these devices are actually hermetically sealed. All right, they are sealed in order not to allow any dust, any contaminants onto the surface, which would in turn lead to scratches on the surface. Obviously, if you scratch the surface, then essentially what you're going to be doing is you're going to be losing your data. All right. This is why it's a very, very important thing that you do not, for example, move your laptops around whilst it's on, whilst they're turned on, for the simple reason that if they're using this kind of hard drive, then you can imagine that with a single jolt of you carrying around the laptop whilst it's on, it might actually cause the such a vibration that it would actually scratch the surface of your hard drive, rendering it useless. And trust me, I've had that experience in the past, and it's not particularly fun, especially when you have important work saved on that hard drive. All right, I learned that the hard way a long time ago. Never again. Right? That was when I was a student. Obviously, I had to submit an assignment, and obviously, the only copy that I had at the time was on that particular hard drive. You can imagine my panic at the time, and unfortunately, no matter how many times this story plays out, it tends to repeat itself quite some time, quite a lot. So yes, essentially, um, each area, all right, on the platter is actually each platter is actually subdivided into billions and billions of these tiny areas, which can independently store either a one or a zero. All right, if it's magnetized, then you would store a one. If it's demagnetized, then you would store a zero, essentially. The good thing about this kind of system is that once you no longer supply the device with electricity, it will retain that information, it will retain that magnetic state, therefore saving your data. Right? So if we actually had to take a look at a particular surface, all right, you can see that we have a number of different tracks. All right, so from the innermost track all the way to the outermost track. Each track is then split up into a number of different sectors, all right? And each sector would have these areas which you will be able to actually place your data upon it. Now, over here, we have what, 8 sectors. You will have much more than 8 sectors. This is just a graphical representation so that you would be able to understand the structure of how the data is actually stored. Essentially, the way that a computer would actually locate a file is that it would first and foremost determine which platter it is on. All right, so platter number essentially, or surface number rather. You would then specify which track it is on, and then you would also specify which sector that data will actually be on. And essentially, what you would do is you would move your read-write heads, all right, over the desired track, all right, and you would wait literally for that sector to move under the read-write head for you to be able to read it. Okay. Now, obviously, the read-write head moves relatively fast, as does the spinning motion of the hard disk. But in reality, if we actually had to compare that speed with the speed of a CPU, for example, it's nowhere close. All right. Even though it might seem fast to our eyes, it is not actually that fast in relation to how hard drives, how a computer actually perceives speed. All right, so this is one of the reasons why hard disks usually would work better when you're saving larger files to the hard disk rather than saving a lot of smaller files. I don't know if you've ever tried to actually copy a lot of files from one hard drive to another. Usually, the larger files would actually be written at a far higher speed than the smaller files. All right. Usually, it actually makes more sense in order for you to actually compress a bunch of small files together into a zip folder so that it would actually look like as though it's one file, and then transfer everything across. So that is something that you might have not known or might not have realized why read and write speeds to hard drives might actually fluctuate so much, but that is usually down to the size of the actual file that you're writing. All right, if you think about it, if you have a lot of small files, essentially each one of those files, the CPU will have to tell the hard disk, listen, you need to write this file. It will need to find a location where it can actually write that file, and then it will write it. If you're doing that multiple times a second for a number of small files, then the number of movements that your read-write head of your hard drive is actually doing is going to explode. All right. If it is a larger file, on the other hand, then the movements that you're going to have from your read-write head is actually going to be minimal. Therefore, the rate of transfer is actually going to go up. All right. What I would like you to do, as sort of like a little bit of homework, is I would like you to take a look at these links that are here on the slides. These will give you a better understanding of how hard drives work. All right, and you will actually be able to see a hard drive running in front of your very eyes in order to be able to perceive or understand the inner workings of such a hard drive. All right. Now, obviously, hard drives are not the only type of magnetic drives that actually exist. All right, they are the most popular. All right, nowadays. Okay, and you can find hard drives. All right, ranging from anything from 1 terabyte and costing just around €50, all the way up to 8 terabytes plus. All right, costing 250 plus euros, depending on obviously where you're actually going to buy them. But but there are other devices which are also considered to be magnetic. All right, we can actually see them over here. These were basically a bit of data with regards to uh, hard drive market share around the world. All right, data taken from 2019 here, and here is basically projected sales of hard disk devices throughout the world, all right, until 2025. It's the trend seems to be as though it's going to go up shortly because of big data. The good thing is that since we now have devices which actually store larger amounts of data, all right, then the sheer number of volumes that actually needs to be sold in order to save the same amount of data is actually going down. There's also an idea that obviously hard drives are also being replaced by SSDs, and basically the lack of certain hard drives that might be being sold now are actually being taken up by SSDs. However, SSDs do also have their disadvantages. Although they might be faster than a traditional hard drive, they do have certain downfalls. All right. In terms of longevity, these devices, all right, these hard drives are actually more reliable. All right, they tend to last a much longer for the simple reason that if taken care of, all right, then um, they would they would be able to read and write data, all right, onto their surfaces pretty much for their entire duration of their lifetime. It will only have to be a mechanical failure that will actually stop it from continuing to work. Here are some other magnetic devices. All right, we have tapes, we have zip drives, floppy disks. All right, um, so these are all the different types of magnetic devices that actually work. All right. Now, with regards to floppy drives, all right, these are the larger 5.25 inch floppy disks, which actually showcase the name of the floppy drive because these were actually flexible. The the floppy disk that probably most of you are aware of as being at least the save icon. Right, this is the 3.5 inch floppy, and the zip drive are all relatively similar technologies to that of the hard drive. What is the difference essentially between each and every one of them? Well, in the case of the 5.25 inch floppy, the disk itself was, as the name implies, floppy, as it was with the 3.5 inch floppy disk. The case around this was also floppy, uh, but what was the major difference between the two was that the speed at which they used to rotate obviously increased, and the storage density, all right, also increased quite dramatically. The zip disk, all right, actually took that notion even a step further. Essentially, the disk itself was not as floppy as that of a floppy disk. It was actually quite robust, but it actually had a lot of traits similar to a floppy. All right, in the sense that the head itself was always in contact with the disk. So the 3.5 inch, the 5.25 inch, and the zip disk all had their heads basically in contact with the disk at any given point in time, right? Which in turn slowed down the revolutions that the disk could actually do, and also reduced the longevity of said devices. In fact, after a number of reads and writes, obviously over a longer period of time, if not taken care of, you would actually get scratches on the surface, which obviously would reduce the longevity of those discs. What the zip drive also managed to do was it managed to take the storage density yet up further still, therefore allowing one to store yet more data onto those devices. In fact, um, one thing that you also need to take into consideration is that the size progressively got smaller. Essentially, between a zip disk and a 3.5 inch floppy, there wasn't that much of a difference in terms of size. However, the zip disk was smaller, but not as thin. If you had to see it, all right. But one of the reasons why the zip disk didn't really stick around for too long was because the zip disk was actually one of those devices that was actually competing with the optical drives, so the CDs, all right. And eventually, once you had CDs and CD writers, all right, then the zip disk essentially became obsolete because they could store nowhere near as much data as a CD. In fact, the zip disk could store up to 250 megabytes, which was big at the time, but the CD could store up to 700 megabytes. obviously overshadowing the zip drive, and therefore making the zip disk obsolete, essentially. The magnetic tapes, on the other hand, all right, some of you might actually remember these types of devices, especially with VHSs and cassette players, essentially. Uh, they actually stored the data on a tape, all right, where it was actually read through by a magnetic head, all right, essentially. Um, if you remember these kinds of devices, you would probably also remember the idea of using head cleaners. So every now and again, you would need to clean the read-write heads of the devices that could actually read these devices, and you would essentially use these in order to store information. All right, but obviously using a sequential format. Essentially, you would have one single read-write head right in the middle, and as the tape passes underneath it, you would actually be able to read or write data to and from that particular device. Um, uh, as you can imagine, these kinds of devices weren't really that useful in order to store data which you need is to access quickly. All right, probably you would be better suited using devices such as the floppy disk, the hard drive, and so on and so forth. These were primarily used for longer term storage, essentially. I hope I answered your question, Keith. Kenneth, sorry, regarding the zip drive. All right.
I'm sorry.
Okay. Yes.
Uh,
Sorry.
as far as the, for example, the zip disk had only one platter, I guess. It has had only one.
Yes. These all of these only had one disk, so you had two surfaces upon which you read and write. Another thing that you might have noticed is that um, uh, between these devices, you would also notice the introduction of a guard, essentially. This adjustable guard, essentially exposing the magnetic disc underneath it. All right, via this window over here, it was always exposed. So that was another reason why these eventually sort of died off. Their lack of storage device, the fact that they were constantly being exposed, so you could actually touch the magnetic surface, which was obviously not a very good idea, you know. And obviously their reliability wasn't as great. In fact, the very first 5.25 inch floppies only used to use one side of the disk. In fact, as you can see over here, even from this picture, you'd see double density. That's because you could actually write data to the top as well as the bottom, which was something new at the time, obviously.
As far as the sectors go, there was this functionality in Windows, I think 7, was the defragmentation, I think. But
That
this,
is that is yes, that is one
but
of the
but this disappeared in Windows 10. I think it disappeared. I don't know.
no, it hasn't disappeared. It actually is hidden from you.
Ah,
In fact, one of the things that Windows 10 does in the background, if you do not set it otherwise, is that it will try to optimize your hard drive whenever your computer is idle. So essentially, in the background, you will actually have this defragmentation happening
okay.
on the go. In fact, if you look at your computer when it's idle, you would still see your hard drive button sort of like flashing every now and again. That is basically because it's actually shifting the position of certain files in order for them to be easily accessible. Essentially, what is happening with this defragmentation, since you mentioned it, there is no guarantee that whenever you're actually writing a file to your hard drive, that it's actually going to be stored in a sequential manner. All right. Um, uh, Essentially, each hard drive would actually contain a file, a lookup index, essentially, which would um, um, indicate which sectors are actually written or used and which were not. Okay, and essentially, when you need to write a file, say, um, for example, this file needs 5 sectors, so it will find the first 5 sectors and will actually try to fill it up that way. Now, that is great in terms of storage capacity, but obviously you're going to be adding files, deleting them, at a very relatively high rate. But what happens is that you might have literally parts of a file spread all over the hard drive, and if you imagine having 5 sectors all over the hard drive on different segments of the hard drive, then essentially in order to read that file, the head would need to do a lot of movement, thus slowing down your computer. So what does this defragmentation do? It will literally try to reorder and restructure these files and rewrite them so that they actually um, are placed sequentially, so that all you need to do is, in order to read a file, is move your head over to the desired area and read it in one go, therefore speeding up the process. But obviously, um, it takes up a lot of time in order to do such a thing. If you think about it, imagine you have a room, all right, and you want to store it with a lot of junk. It's easy. You just throw stuff into it, and you start filling it up with junk. But if you want to organize it, which is different, then you would actually take a lot longer in order to be able to do that. You probably need to move things around in order to organize effectively, and that's essentially what used to happen, or what still happens rather, within these hard disk drives. All right. This defragmentation with regards to SSDs does happen, all right, but not as frequently, for the simple reason that you don't want it to constantly be rewriting data on your SSD, as we'll be seeing in a moment, because obviously it would actually limit the lifespan of the SSD. Um, um, with regards to an SSD being more jumbled up, really and truly, it doesn't make that much of a difference. All right. That it is one of the advantages of an SSD, but we'll talk about that a bit later. But you can still do it, technically speaking. All right, especially if you have files that are going to be more permanent than others. All right, files that are going to be retained on the disk for a longer period of time, rather than files which are constantly being changed. So it can still happen, technically speaking, because again, from the computer's point of view, from the operating system's point of view, it really doesn't matter what kind of device you actually have. All right, it looks at it as a storage device, full stop. So technically speaking, you can still perform this defragmentation, and that's why certain people would tend to turn that off for the automatic disk defragmentation for SSDs. In order again to preserve the longevity of these devices. Note that these magnetic tapes and discs, all right, are still available if you look around hard enough for them. Um, you can still find tapes on Amazon. All right, you can still find floppy drives. All right, probably the older ones. However, uh, they tend to die off quite quickly. In fact, the relative price for each and every one of these devices, since they're no longer as popular, all right, they tend to go up relatively in relation to their storage density, essentially. If you think about it, over here you have a 10 pack of floppy drives, all right, worth 23 or 24 pounds, all right, where in each disk you can store up to 1.44 megabytes. Compare that to a disk, even a CD, which costs 15 cents, and you would be able to store, 60, 70 times that amount of data that you actually have over there. It's not actually worthwhile, because obviously older technology, therefore it becomes more and more niche. But you'd be surprised, there are still some machines, or there are still some systems which actually use older machines. In fact, until recently, the air traffic control computer that was used even in Malta was using a very old machine. For the simple reason that the system that they actually employed was one that worked, right? And one of the things that you don't want to do is, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. That's the idea. So recently they actually upgraded the system. When I say recently, a few years ago, I don't know exactly when, but I do remember that up to a few years ago, they actually had old systems. I mean Pentium 2s and 3s, running basically aviation traffic management software, essentially. Eventually, even those needed to be updated. All right, so let's move on to optical storage. All right, so when we're talking about optical storage, we're actually talking about discs. All right, so CDs, DVDs, Blu-ray. All right, essentially they all work in exactly the same way. All right, the main difference between one and the other is essentially um, the different laser that they use, but we'll get to that in a moment. So essentially, what optical drives use in order to read and write data from the disk is they use a laser head. All right. Essentially, what happens is that the read-write head will fire a laser onto the disk surface itself. All right, and depending on how that laser that has been fired is reflected back, it would be able to perceive it as a 1 or a 0. All right. Now, when we talk about read-only discs, all right. When I say read-only discs, are those discs that you would probably buy for an album or a DVD or a game or something, or a Blu-ray film or something of the sort. What usually happens is that you'd have a surface, all right, on the disk, which is made up of a number of what are known as pits and lands. Lands are essentially flat areas, all right, whereas pits are sort of like minute indentations on the surface of the disk. Essentially, the idea is that these pits and lands would actually change the reflective property of the disk, and therefore would allow you to be able to differentiate between ones and zeros in an optical manner. Essentially, the laser will be shone onto these tightly packed pits and lands. All right, the reflection is then red. All right, and those small changes, all right, in the intensity of the laser light that is reflected back, all right, will be read by a photo sensor and therefore converted into ones and zeros. Essentially, this is what we mean by pits and lands. So as you can see, all right, these over here, all right, these holes, those are known as pits, all right. Wherever you don't have a hole, all right, that is known as a land, all right. Now the pit width, all right, and the distance between one track or between one track and the other, essentially still one track all the way around, all right. Whereas a hard disk had a number of different tracks, all right, from the smaller inner circle all the way out, all right. With regards to a an optical drive, essentially what you'd have is one spiral, so it's a continuous spiral, all right. But you also have sort of like a spiral spacing, if you will, all right. We still call it a track spacing. That track spacing, the pit width, the the pit length, and so on and so forth. That obviously depends upon which device we're talking about. These values that you see over here are valid for that of a CD, all right. But obviously, a CD has the smaller storage area or storage density, so therefore these values might seem relatively big when compared to, say, that of a Blu-ray disc, for example. All right. So, how does it work? So essentially, when there are no pits, all right, the laser would would essentially not reflect as much usually. All right, when we're talking about CD or disc ROMs, all right, those discs that you cannot overwrite. Okay, essentially the laser wouldn't be able to pass through this layer and won't be able to reach the reflective layer at the back, and therefore it will register it as a zero. Where you have these pits, however, on the other hand, the laser would shine right through, hit the reflective surface, record it back, and that would be considered to be a one. Mana. So essentially, that's how an optical ROM disk works. What about rewriters, all right, or CD writers? Essentially, CD writers do not make use of the idea of pits and lands, all right. Uh, Essentially, what they use is they use or they alter the opaqueness, all right, or how reflective the surface actually is by burning, all right, parts of the surface of the disk, essentially. And again, all right, this usually would act in a very similar way to that of the pits and lands, and that would be recorded as ones and zeros, respectively. Incidentally, on a CD, if you actually had to take the spiral track and unravel it, all right, it will actually reach 5 kilometers in length on a single disc, right? And that's just the CD. So you can, so essentially, you can imagine what would actually happen with regards to a DVD as well as a Blu-ray disc, since the spiral is more tightly packed, essentially. So this is if you actually had to take the disk itself and split it up, it's actually made up of a number of different layers. All right. So let's talk about the CD-ROM essentially. Okay. So here, all right, marked as A, all right, or part of the disk A, that is the polycarbonate layer, which actually includes the pits and lands, all right. That is created um, uh, for that particular disk. All right, the laser is shown all right at the surface. If there is a pit, then the laser will actually carry through up to layer B. All right, and layer B is basically a very very thin layer of aluminium. All right, which or sometimes even gold or some very reflective layer, which will allow the reflection to come back to the photo sensor. All right, if there is a land, then essentially the laser won't actually make it through. Okay. So essentially, this is where you'd have your pits and lands. This is where you would have your reflective layer. All right. Upon that, you would actually have a layer of varnish, which would actually protect the shiny surface of your disc. And upon that, you would have another layer. All right, um, um, with your printed label essentially showing the artwork of the disc itself. All right. If it were a rewriter, then essentially instead of having pits and lands over here, so the difference would be in this area, you would have this area with a number of areas which are transparent, other areas which are opaque, which essentially do exactly the same thing. All right. So if it's transparent, then by default, all of the light would actually be, or the laser light would be able to pass through it no matter what. Once you start burning data into it, then you would make certain areas less transparent, and therefore you would be stopping this laser from passing through the reflective um, um, portion of the disk, essentially. Obviously, all of these are sort of like sandwiched on top of each other, all right, very tightly. This is sort of like an exploded view, if you will, of the hard disk.
So,
Yes.
just out, this is just more of a curiosity when it comes to CD rewritable CDs.
Yes.
I don't know.
Ones that you can rewrite over the top.
Yes.
Okay.
I don't know. Back in the day, I don't know if I had done something wrong or if actually that is the nature of the disk. Once you rewrite on the actual disk, the old data becomes inaccessible, or that is not the intended nature of it.
Mana. Mana, with regards to a rewriter, so a disk, which you would not only be able to write it once, but you would also be able to write to it again and again and again. Then essentially, what used to happen was that you'd first and foremost need to sort of like scrape off a layer, if you will. All right, it would have a more precise laser in order to be able to scrape off a layer, and then you'd be able to burn it yet again in order to have new data. So essentially, no, unless all right was you had the disks where you would actually say, listen, I am closing this session off, so you wouldn't be able to write more data for that particular session. Or else you would have other disks which you would say, listen, this is still open, I would want to write more data onto it at a later stage. So it would depend. If you had closed off the disk, then essentially what you would be saying is that you would need to erase the entire layer and write over it, essentially.
I remember. Yes, the one being closed or open at the end.
But you would need. But if you were going to erase what you had before and rewrite over it, then essentially you would only be able to do that a number of times. So it was very limited. I think 2 or 3 times. It wasn't more than that. Not that I remember, at least. One of the main reasons why they didn't really catch on as much, these rewriter disks, was because hard disks started to become bigger very, very, very quickly, because they started using different logic as to how they actually split up the different sectors onto the hard drive, and therefore store more data upon them. They also were becoming faster. And if you've ever tried to write data onto a disk or burn data onto a disk, you would always realize that the amount of time that actually took you in order to write this data was exorbitant. I mean, it took a long time in order to do so. I mean,
it was for 40 minutes to an hour, if I remember correctly.
Exactly, and if you think about it, not only did it take, let's say, 30 minutes. So for a CD, in order to burn a CD, if it used to take you 30 minutes in order to burn a CD, then imagine how much longer it would actually take in order to burn a DVD, and how much longer it would then take in order to burn a Blu-ray. They still are possible, but probably it would be worth more of your while if you actually invested in another hard drive and actually copied your data over to the hard drive. The advent of cloud storage as well removed the need of disks, at least for the domestic user, in that way. I mean, as a sort of like backup. I know what it means to have backups on these kinds of discs. I have a box which is about yay big, to go with sleeves and I would be able to traverse them, and that was only for my games, and then I had another one for my DVDs, and then I had another one for my music. So you can imagine, to Paul, even the amount of sheer capacity of volume that you would actually need to have in order to store these discs then becomes unwieldy. I mean, considering that you can actually put everything onto a hard drive and or a NAS drive or something of the sort, and pretty much all of your data stored over there. To go. So you can imagine that probably.
Well, thank you, Mitesh. And this stayed with me because I remember it clearly. It was a backup. So I added some files onto it and essentially had lost everything post format.
And incidentally, this is something that that you might actually be might find interesting. I don't know if you remember the size, why the size of these tapes were the size that they actually were. So this 180, for example, do you know what that refers to? Really and truly,
No, not really. No.
it's basically the number of minutes of data that you can actually store onto it. In terms of these types of tapes, it was usually video. So 180s, 3 hours worth of video. The reason why CDs stored, CDs stored 700 megabytes was because 700 megabytes was equivalent to an hour worth of music. So that's where it came from, essentially. The size 700 megabytes stemmed from that idea of storing data, essentially. In fact, if you actually try to burn a disk with music, all right, uncompressed music, so wave files, you would probably be hard pushed to actually store up to, say, 12 songs. 12 songs is pushing it.
Next.
So obviously this is no longer that much of an issue, considering that we now have compression techniques. But back in the day, we didn't have that many compression techniques either.
Thank
So
you.
essentially, all right. So essentially, when we talk about optical drives, each and every optical drive works in roughly the same way, the same manner, no matter what kind of technology we're talking about, be it a compact disc, be it a DVD, be it a Blu-ray disc. All right. Essentially, they all work exactly the same. The main difference is in the lasers. All right. In fact, the major shift that actually happened was when Blu-ray actually came out. I remember at the time there was actually two different technologies that were actually competing. You actually had the HD DVD and you had the Blu-ray disc. One was pioneered by Xbox and Microsoft. The other one was pioneered by Sony and PlayStation at the time. All right, for those of you who are interested, and roughly they had exactly the same sort of technology. All right, essentially they worked in exactly the same way. They could store roughly the same amount of data, but one actually came out with the PlayStation 3, I remember, and it was actually combined inside of the console, which made it very, very popular because not only were you actually getting a games console, the PlayStation 3 at the time, but you were also getting a DVD, a Blu-ray DVD player. Whereas with the Xbox, that was not actually the case. You actually had to buy an external drive in order to be able to watch HD DVDs on it, and that's why Blu-ray won at the end of the day. Essentially, CDs and DVDs use lasers which were in the red region, all right, of light. So you had CDs having a wavelength, all right, on their laser of 780 nanometers, whereas DVDs had a laser with a wavelength of 650 nanometers, whereas Blu-ray, all right, hence where the name comes from, all right, went more towards the blue spectrum of light, all right. In fact, a violet, it used a violet laser, and the wavelength of that laser is by far smaller. In fact, it's 405 nanometers, all right. And essentially, this is the difference between each and every one of them. All right. So as you can see, this is the pits and lands, if you will, of a CD drive. This would be the laser size, if you will, that would be shining directly onto the surface. This would actually be the amount of penetration that the laser would actually need to do in order to reach the surface. All right, that they are reading. All right, the DVD, since they had a shorter wavelength, meant that the spacing would actually be smaller. In fact, it was exactly twice as small. All right, so if the size of a pit was 800 nanometers, then for a DVD it was 400 nanometers. Laser obviously had to become smaller in order to be able to fit on the tracks. All right, and again the depth went down slightly. All right, HD DVD again halved the size of each individual pit, but it also had to reduce the wavelength, all right, in order to get a much finer laser laser in order to be able to read the individual tracks. And Blu-ray, on the other hand, went smaller still. All right. Essentially, all of these different values that you can see over here are also explained over here. So when we talk about track pitch, all right, we're talking about P. So that's essentially how much you would actually need to move the head from in order to be able to read one track over to the next. All right. W here, all right, is the width of each individual track. L here is the minimum length for each pit. All right. Omega is the size of the laser. All right, of the laser spot. All right, and lambda. All right, those are the depth, the wavelengths of these lasers. And over here, we also have the depth indicated, all right, of where the data is actually stored in relation to the cross section of the disk. And notice that essentially all of the disks, in terms of their thickness, was exactly the same. All right. Just in certain circumstances, the data was actually stored closer to the surface. All right. This is one of the reasons why, for example, Blu-ray discs actually had to be made up of a harder material than that of CDs. If you remember, all right, back in the day, if you, for example, scratched the surface of a CD, you could actually get it refinished, all right? So such that you would actually be able to read the information on it again, essentially. Obviously, you would need to take it to a specialist in order to be able to do such a thing, but it was more possible to do with a CD. All right. Again, that was for two reasons: because the polycarbonate system, polycarbonate material that was actually used for the pits and pans was actually softer than that of a Blu-ray disc. I remember back when I was I was a salesperson at Exotique, and one of the sales pitches that we used to say whenever we're trying to sell a Blu-ray player was that, listen, the discs do not actually get scratched as much. In fact, we used to take a disc and literally swipe it with a key at the back of it, and you wouldn't actually see scratches at the back of it, where you would obviously see that with a CD. I don't know if it's still the case, but back then, back in 2008, when these used to come out, that was definitely the case. Any questions so far?
All right.
No, thank you.
All right. So, obviously, these are still around. All right, you can still buy drives as well as blank media. All right, onto for your devices. All right. There might not they might not be as popular as they once were. However, optical media is actually making a bit of a resurgency. All right, especially when it comes to the future of long-term storage. All right, I would highly suggest that you take a look at this YouTube video as well as these links over here to showcase the future of optical media. You can actually see that, in fact, these types of disk data storages can actually be taken up to the next level in order to be able to store data for more than 600 years, essentially. All right, let's move on to electronic storage. All right, when we talk about electronic storage, we're particularly going to be talking about SSDs, all right? But it's not only SSDs. Essentially, we're talking about any solid state device, all right, which stores data electronically. Essentially, we're talking about flash memory, all right? Now, flash memory works in a very, very similar fashion to how RAM works. However, with the added benefit of it not being volatile. Essentially, all right, when the transistors are turned on or off, they remain like so, even when data is not actually, or rather, current is not actually being supplied to the device. All right. So essentially, the inner architecture of an SSD is very, very similar to normal RAM drives, essentially. All right. In fact, what makes a flash drive a flash drive is this SSD controller. All right. This is where you're actually going to be storing your data. All right. You might have them on one surface. You might have them on the back. All right. Nowadays, they also come in NVMe format, all right, so that they can actually be plugged in directly onto your PCI Express lanes of your computer, all right, in order to increase the speed, all right. And some of them are actually coming up with very high density storage. I mean, I've seen an NVMe drive, which is so I have one over here plugged into my computer. Essentially, it's about that size. Yes, this is an external NVMe drive. All right, and one of these could actually store up to 8 terabytes worth of data nowadays at the same speeds that you would normally associate with SSDs. All right, and when it comes to these kinds of drives, you can actually have much more storage. This is not actually a USB flash drive. All right. If I actually have to, it's basically a hard drive. All right. Let me just show it to you in terms of a picture. Oops. That's the hard drive that they're actually talking about here. All right. So this one over here can actually store up to 1 terabyte. All right. As you can see, it's quite small, and it actually has a read and write speed much faster than the traditional SSDs that are coming out on normal desktop machines. But they are now taking this even a step further in order to store 8 terabytes worth of data. So yeah, these devices are actually becoming the new norm. All right. So essentially, all of these different types of devices. All right. Over here, we're talking about RAM. All right. Here we have a flash drive for
SD.
an SD card. An SD card. Yes. That is predominantly used for cameras. All right. Your USB dongles, all right, and the pen drives, they all work in essentially the same way, all right. Essentially, all right, the SSD works in a very simple manner, all right. Essentially, it will hold the value of two different voltages, all right. A programming voltage is basically the equivalent of saying that you're storing a value of 0, and a higher eraser voltage sets the value to 1. All right. Essentially, the two voltages that we're talking about here, the programming voltage and the erasure voltage, all right, those are actually voltages which are higher than what is actually required in order to read those voltages and therefore be interpreted by the computer. All right. Essentially, the reason why these voltages needs to be higher is because it's because of this additional voltage that you are actually going to allow, all right, data to travel over what is known as a tunnel oxide layer. So if I had to take a look at each individual cell, the cell will look like this, essentially. All right. So if you had to compare this with a normal transistor, so let me just show you. So transistor cross section. All right. So if I had to compare the two, all right, you still have a source, all right. You still have a drain, okay, source and the drain, all right, and you still have a gate, all right, and you have a well, and you have this insulating oxide layer, essentially, okay, in both. The only difference is that you actually, this SSD actually has a more complicated, if you will, more complicated gate, because it actually is split into two. You have your control gate as well as your floating gate. Essentially, when you are actually writing data, all right, over here, and if you want to erase it, essentially you would need to supply a much higher voltage over here in order to allow the electrons, all right, in order to flow over this tunnel oxide over to the drain, right? If you do not pass enough voltage on this side, then essentially you wouldn't be able to allow electrons to pass through this tunnel oxide and therefore drain onto the other side. Right? If so, essentially the amount of voltage is actually being passed over here is going to determine whether or not you're going to be able to erase the data that you would have in this floating gate. There are a number of different videos that can actually allow you to understand more clearly as to how an SSD works, and this is one of them. All right, I would suggest that you take a look at it in a bit more detail at home in order to understand how an SSD works. But essentially, the idea is that you would need to apply a voltage in order to store certain data, but you would also need to apply a higher voltage in order to be able to erase it. All right. However, when it comes to an SSD, SSDs usually have a limitation in the sense that SSDs, when it comes to actually writing, all right, or programming, all right, it is relatively easy, all right. In fact, you can actually write data quite quickly onto an SSD. Erasing is harder. It's much harder. Why? Because you would need to force electrons down that oxide tunnel that we discussed earlier. However, forcing electrons down that tunnel oxide would actually deteriorate the structure of the cell. All right, and it will take more and more voltage in order to be able to allow this transfer in order for you to erase it. In fact, when it comes to SSDs, brand new SSDs will always run faster than a used one, even if they are made from the same brand, they're of the same ilk, and so on and so forth. A new SSD will always be much faster. In fact, SSDs have a limited number of writes, all right, it's not as limited as, say, for example, the CD rewriter. It's more in the area of 400,000 writes, but it's still finite. All right. In fact, the amount of electricity or the amount of current that is actually needed in order to constantly write to this cell or erase and write again to the cell will increase throughout the life cycle of the SSD. All right, up to a certain point whereby the controller wouldn't actually be able to allow any more currents to pass through the oxide. Essentially, the tunnel oxide would deteriorate so much that essentially you wouldn't actually be able to erase it anymore. It doesn't mean that you wouldn't be able to read it, all right? But essentially, what would happen is that particular cell will then become a read-only cell. Obviously, when that happens, the probability is that you would need to purchase yourself a new SSD and transfer the data over to a new SSD, and then you'd be able to continue over with that. That is still why the idea of hard drives, or the traditional hard drives, is not yet dead, essentially. All right. Obviously, there are different types of SSDs that are on the market. These are the normal SATA SSDs that exist on the market that fit in the same that have the same basic dimensions of the hard drives used in most laptops. Essentially, all right, they can range from something as small as 64 gigabytes all the way up to 8 terabytes. I've seen some of them going up to 8 terabytes, but they are on the rise. And as you can see, even their usage has been going up over the years, as we can see over here. All right, these are predicted values of how much the SSD market is going to actually be worth in the coming years. Having said that, currently there is a bit of a shortage of silicon due to mining, and one of the reasons why hard drives of this ilk, all right, SSDs, are actually so expensive is because of this global shortage of silicon, essentially. All right. So essentially, what we have done is we've managed to go over and understand the different types of technologies, all right, that exist within magnetic, optical, and storage and electronic storage, and we've basically gone over how each and every of these devices actually work. Now, I understand there's a lot more depth that one could actually go into. We're actually going to be covering some of that additional material within intermediate computer architecture. All right. So that would be a topic for another day, at least for those of you who actually do have intermediate computer architecture. All right. Here are a number of sources. I would suggest that you take a look at those as well. All right. As an additional reading in and around the topic itself. All right. So that concludes sort of like the topic of data storage. The next topic that we're going to be taking a look at is the idea of input and output devices. This is relatively simple, all right? We shouldn't spend too much time on this. But before we actually start on this, are there any questions about what we've just covered up to this point?
None from my end. Thank you.
Okay.
Yes, I didn't catch which topic will be covered in the intermediate one.
Essentially, what we're going to be talking in the intermediate computer architecture, we'll be talking a lot more in detail as to how hard drives work. All right. So how they actually split up the hard drive logically, how they actually access certain areas, what kind of scheduling system can actually be used, and so on and so forth, in order to make best use of the hard disk. So that is one of the topics that we're going to be talking about. We're also going to be delving a lot deeper into the way that optical drives also work as well. So those are a bit, so just as a bit of a bit more understanding of what we're going to be covering in intermediate computer architecture.
Thank you.
All right.
You mentioned the SSD controller, but I
Yes.
didn't understand what's its role.
So the SSD controller is what is actually I closed it off. But no, let me just open it up again. So essentially, the SSD controller is what is actually going to be able to pass those voltages, all right, that you are going to be needing in order to be able to program cell, all right. So essentially, this SSD controller, all right, basically is going to allow, all right, power, all right, from your connectors, all right, in order to be able to force electrons, all right, over this tunnel oxide over here, right, so that you would be able to write and erase, all right. That's essentially what it does. Okay.
Okay.
Any other questions?
If the limited writes and rewrites is what contributes to a computer slowing down over time, or a phone.
Yes, it could. Phones and computers that have SSDs, yes, they would eventually start to slow down because of that. Not only, but because there are certain other devices or certain other factors which could also slow down your device. Chiefly amongst those is software updates to a certain extent, because software would actually require more and more power in order to run the latest and new and the greatest features that have actually come out, and eventually your device would become not adequate enough in order to run those features, and therefore it starts to slow down as well. So that's another reason why devices tend to become slower and slower with age. There are other factors such as if it's not a sealed unit, it might have actually gotten dirty inside, and therefore, if it's dirty, then it starts overheating, and therefore, if it's overheating, then it starts slowing down as well. So there are multiple different factors, but yes, SSD storage or flash storage is actually one of them. Okay?
Thank you.
All right. Shall we move on to the other topic? I would imagine
It's
so.
okay. It's okay for me.
Okay. All right. So essentially, within the set of slides, what we're going to be doing is we're going to be talking a little bit about different types of input and output peripherals. I'm sure you're aware of most of them. Most of you are actually using them currently, all right, as we are talking about in this particular lecture. However, I just wanted to point out that these devices do exist, all right, and they are also fall under one portion of the von Neumann architecture, being these I/O devices, which are still in communication with the rest of your system via the system bus. All right. So, what is an input device? An input device is essentially a piece of hardware that allows you to send data, all right, to the computer. Now, this can be done in a myriad of different ways. It can be wireless, it can be wired, all right. The technology of wireless system that is actually adopted is also up for debate. It could be infrared, it could be Bluetooth, it could be Wi-Fi. We are not here limited by the type of technology that we're talking about. As long as it sends data to the computer, even if it is an instruction, then essentially it can be considered as an input device. All right, the most basic of all computer input devices that exist happens to be the keyboard. All right, in fact, it's one of the older input devices. It actually took its form from the traditional typewriters, essentially, and it was one of the first devices that was actually used in order to be able to enter data and commands into the computer. Along with that, probably you would also imagine that we would have mice, but mice actually came out a long time ago, a long time after, rather, the notion of the keyboard. All right. In fact, for a long time, the mouse was actually not really that important for computer use. It was only through the advent of graphical user interfaces, sorry, that the advent of a mouse became more and more useful. Essentially, being able to point around the screen, all right, and indicate where the cursor is going to be placed in order to activate portions of your program, essentially. All right. One thing that I'm currently using right now as an input device would be the microphone, right? Microphone, which allows me to convert audio sounds, all right, or audio waves into digital signals, which are then transferred onto you and being played back to you via your speakers or via your headsets, all right, which incidentally would be an output device. Other devices that you can imagine, you have cameras, you have scanners, you have barcode scanners, you can have OCRs, you could have touch screens, you could have, I don't know, game pads, if you will, game controllers, steering wheels. You could have graphics tablets, if you will. All right, all of these other types of devices that can actually be used in order to send signals to the computer. All right, now obviously, in relation to input devices, you also have output devices, or devices which will allow data to transfer from the computer back to the user. And again, it can also happen in a wired or wireless environment. In these cases, we're primarily talking about visual feedback, all right, through the use of monitors, all right, to showcase what the computer is actually, or what the user is actually working on at that particular time. Again, these are one of the more prevalent output devices for most computers. Not all computers actually need a visual output, all right? In fact, servers, for example, certain servers could actually have what is known as a headless system, which doesn't actually have an output to a visual monitor. All right, it can actually be handy with regards to a web service where you would actually require most of your power to go towards calculations, for example, via the server. All right, but most computer devices, it's fair to say, actually have monitors and sometimes even more than one. Kind of like what I am currently sporting now. Another traditional type of output device would be that of a printer. All right, something where you would actually be able to produce a hard copy of some data that has been processed. All right. Nowadays, all right, the line between input and output devices sometimes is a little bit blurry if you think about it. All right, the screen of your phone, all right, that is both an input and output device because you can actually provide instructions to the computer itself as well as see your direct feedback as you're going around. Printers nowadays are also printers, photocopiers, and scanners, for example, all right, which is basically a blend between an input and the output device. Headsets, for example, have both sound as well as microphone output, so you can actually see that certain devices are actually more hybrid versions. They're both input and output devices rather than just pure input or pure output devices. Another form of output device that you might be more aware of is the idea of speakers, all right, that would provide outputs to your audio, all right. You can have something like this, which would be a stereo output, all right, because you would have two speakers, one for the left, one for the right, all right, or surround sound speakers, all right, where you'd have a number of speakers to simulate the sound coming from different areas around you, as well as a subwoofer, all right, for the lower frequencies, all right. And other output devices could include stuff like projectors, stuff like headsets, stuff like plotters, and so on. Right? A plotter is basically a large printer, which is predominantly used by architects in order to print out massive plans. All right, but irrespective of what type of device we're talking about, all right, they all need to communicate with the computer in some way, all right. In fact, they are plugged into a computer through the use of what are known as ports. Now, ports come in many different shapes and sizes, all right, and they are designed in order to be made use of for a number of different types of devices. So over here, for example, we have optical link, which is predominantly used for audio. We have the normal USB Type A. We have FireWire, which these different three types of FireWire. Yeah, FireWire 4-pin, FireWire 400, FireWire 800 to 3200. All right, these were predominantly used for data transfer on older output or data storage devices. You have your Ethernet, you have your modem, all right, your RJ11 and RJ45 connectors. You have your serial devices and PS2 devices for your keyboards and mice, all right. Your VGA connector, your serial connector, all right, your SATA connector, your parallel 36-pin, and your SCSI, all right, 50-pin connectors, all right, and so on and so forth. I'm not going to go through each and every one of these, all right. You don't need to know each and every one of these, but it's a good idea to be able to identify, all right, most of these different types of ports on your computer. Essentially, each and every one of these different types of ports allows you to connect different types of devices. All right. However, having said that, most of these might actually be coming towards an end, essentially, because we're now moving towards the idea of using one specific type of connector, which is the Thunderbolt connector and USB Type C, essentially, which we'll be talking about in a moment. Essentially, you'd usually find all of these ports on what is known as the backplate, all right, of your tower, all right, where you'd actually be able to plug in your different components or your different cables into the back of your tower, all right, in order to be able to make use of your computer. Obviously, depending on which device you're trying to connect, you would need to use a different port. Okay. However, as I was saying, all right, nowadays, all right, most of the ports that we're probably going to be seeing in the future are going to be more of these USB type C devices here, all right, or these Thunderbolt devices. Essentially, nowadays, it is actually possible, all right, over one connection, such as a Thunderbolt connection, you'd be able to charge your phone, you'd be able to showcase a display, so you'd be able to actually transfer data towards a display of 4K quality. You would be able to have high-speed data transfer all over that same port. All right, and if the trend continues in the way that it seems to be going, at least nowadays, essentially most of these other ports that we have discussed up to this point are actually going to be converted or replaced rather using these types of connectors in the future. For two reasons. First and foremost, it actually introduces an element of uniformity. All right. In fact, the USB Type-C connector allows you to connect the wire in whichever orientation you prefer. So there's no longer a bottom or a top. Essentially, the orientation doesn't really matter. So you have that. Secondly, you have the element that every device would be using the same sort of interface. Thirdly, it is quite small as a port, therefore you would be able to fit more of them. And fourthly, because of the high speed that is actually and the versatility of that particular connection. Nowadays it seems as though that is the next way forward with regards to ports in general. But obviously you can also find these types of adapters which would be able to take that particular Thunderbolt device and split it up into other different types of devices. You could actually even have network connections that connect into such devices. It is becoming that fast, essentially. All right, so you could actually display, charge, have an SD connection, a normal USB 3 connection here, all right, all going through the same port, whilst at the same time, all at the same time, and using less power than you would have normally used for other devices, essentially. So that's quite cool if you think about it. All right, so that basically concludes. I told you it's quite easy, this area of input and output devices. I'm sure that you would be able to mention a number of other input and output devices. All right, the key thing here is to be aware, all right, of these different devices and what they actually offer as devices. All right. So, any questions up to this point?
Well, clear. Thank you.
All right. So, let's move on to the last topic that I would want to start off today. Essentially, I wanted to talk a little bit about operating systems. Okay. So essentially, what we're going to be discussing in this set of slides is basically the different functions that that are offered by operating systems. We're going to be looking at different types of operating systems, and we're also going to be explaining the booting process of a computer. Probably we might not be able to cover all of it today, all right? But we'll start off by at least describing the different functions that the operating system provides, and hopefully start mentioning off different types of operating systems. So let's get started. So first and foremost, up to this point, from all the things that we've actually discussed so far, we have talked about how the information is represented. So we talked about binary and that the computer works with binary and ones and zeros. We've talked about the different types of storage and how the different types of memory that is actually present within a computer. And we've also talked about different processes provided by the CPU. However, we haven't really broken down yet how these operations are actually regulated by the computer. How, for example, when I click for a text editor to be opened, what goes on underneath? How does the computer know that if I'm running a program on one computer and I open up, for example, a web browser, what is the computer actually going to do? How is this actually going to be regulated? At some point, somewhere, these types of decisions needs to be made. And that is essentially where the operating system comes in. Essentially, the operating system is a very sophisticated piece of software, all right, which is quite large and quite complex. And if you ever tried to install an operating system and understood the length of time that it actually takes in order to set up an operating system on a computer, all right, you would appreciate how big these systems have become lately. But not only that, they are entirely complex because they have a lot of responsibilities. Essentially, everything that you're doing on your computer has to run by your operating system. It controls every file, it controls every device, it controls every piece of memory that you have, it controls every nanosecond that the CPU is doing, and it's controlling essentially everything that your computing is doing at any given point in time. Essentially, your operating system is the boss, all right? What it says goes, all right? Full stop, okay? So essentially what we're talking about here is the second branch, if you will, of what we classify as software, all right? When we talk about software, we usually tend to split it alongside what is known as application software and what we know as system software, right? Application software, we're talking here about apps, so games and word processors, Excel sheets, those kinds of devices, all right, or those kind of applications rather, all right, those fall under what are known as application software examples, all right. System software, on the other hand, as the name implies, has more to do with or has more to do with the system itself, all right, the computer system itself, all right. And usually we tend to split this up into three other categories, all right. We have what is known as program development tools, all right. So the tools that we use in order to develop other programs, all right. System utilities, as well as the operating system. So the operating system is one part of what we know as system software. So what are these different categories? What are included in each section? So when we talk about program development tools, essentially we're talking about programming languages and source code editors. Essentially, any programming language that you are using in order to write code, all right, including its debuggers, program documentation, translators, and decompilers. All of that, all right, fall under the era of program development tools. Essentially, any tool that you're using in order to build other applications, that is forms under the idea of program development tools, even if you're going to be creating other application software, all right? So if you're using Java, for example, in order to write a piece of code or an application, all right? The IDE that you're using or the integrated development environment that you're using in order to write that Java application, all right, is the program development tools. The programs that you develop with this IDE, on the other hand, those would be application. So that would be application software. Okay. So that is program development tools. What about system utility tools? We already mentioned some of them. We talked about disk management tools such as the disk defragmenters. Alongside, we can also talk about the idea of disk partitioners, disk formatters, disk cloners, and so on and so forth. So disk management tools fall under the idea of system utilities. You also have other utilities such as file management tools, all right? We're talking about backup utilities, browsers, viewers, all right? Essentially, if you think about it, even your normal file explorer, all right, like so, that is also a browser, all right, essentially, because you are browsing the files on your computer, all right. Other tools such as virus scanners, firewalls, and stuff like that, those fall under what are known as protection tools, which are nowadays more and more important, especially given our interconnected lives. All right, diagnostic tools. All right, which will be able to provide you with an understanding of how well your system is performing at any given point in time, as well as other account management tools. All right, so tools that allow you to create accounts for your operating system, maintenance and logging, and so on and so forth. Those are different types of system utilities. All right, but we are primarily going to be focused on the idea of the operating system. Essentially, the function of the operating system is to make sure that it makes use or makes best use of the computer's resources. At the end of the day, your operating system wants your computer to be running in an optimal fashion as much as possible. All right. So you want to make use of all of the CPU cycles. You want to make sure that you are making use of memory in the most efficient manner. You want to make sure that you are using your devices in the most efficient manner, essentially. Okay, and you do that, all right, by doing sort of like the in-between job between the user, all right, as well as the applications that the user is actually using. So essentially, it provides a virtual or presents a virtual machine to the user, and it also presents a virtual machine to the software. All right. What do we mean by a virtual machine? Well, if you think about it, the computer that you use on a regular basis, all right, if you're navigating files and folders and stuff like that, all right, essentially you are presented with a simplified or maybe a user-friendly way of how one can actually navigate from one folder to the next, or how you can actually open up one application versus another application. All right. You have the graphical user interface where you'd be able to click around on your screen and select the operations that you would want to select, essentially. All right. Underneath the the computer doesn't actually work in that way, all right? It's an abstracted view of it. It's kind of like, if we had to compare it to something, all right? If we talk about a car, all right, if you put your foot on the gas pedal, all right, in your mind, all right, when you're driving the car, you are imagining that pressing the gas pedal means that you're going to make the car move faster or drive faster, essentially, all right? But what is actually going on under the hood is actually by far more complex, right? By pressing the gas pedal, essentially what you're doing is you're opening the throttle body, which in turn is sucking more air and more fuel into the engine, which in turn is making the making the air fuel mixture bigger, which is then exploding, and so on and so forth. But you're not thinking about all of these different processes that is going on hundreds of times a second when you're actually driving your car, all right? In the same way, when you double click on a folder, you're not really thinking about the processes that is actually going on underneath in order to open that folder for you underneath the hood. So that is what we mean by having this virtual machine being presented to you, to the user. But it's also doing the same thing for the software. If you think about it, all right, especially for those of you who use PC computers rather than Mac computers, all right. But even then, you know, if we think about PCs, you can imagine that we have a number of different hardware configurations that can exist within a PC, right? Probably if we had to go round robin and describe the processor that each and every one of us is using, probably each and every one of us has a different processor used on their computer. The same thing about RAM, and not only the manufacturer of the RAM, but also the quantity of RAM, the number of hard disks that you would actually have connected to your computer, and so on and so forth. All right, but probably I can say with an air of confidence, most of us is actually running a Windows application or a Windows operating system. All right, and probably Windows 10 operating system. So essentially, the operating system that is presented to most of us, at least in this class, is pretty much identical. All right. However, the hardware underneath, right, is going to be completely and utterly different. So how is it possible for one to actually run similar applications and run similar operating systems, all right, on various different configurations of hardware? Well, essentially, this is where the virtual environment comes into play. Essentially, all right, the application would ask the operating system to act upon its behalf, all right, when communicating with the specific hardware components that you have installed on your computer. So, for example, if you have, say, if your computer is trying to display an image onto your screen, okay, and on your computer you have an NVIDIA GeForce 970 installed, all right, on your computer, as an example, all right. Essentially, the software that is trying to display onto the screen is passing a command onto the operating system and says, listen, I want to be able to display this picture, all right? And it would be the operating system's job to translate that into a fashion that would be understood by the graphic card underneath. That's where drivers come in, yes, but essentially, it's not the application's job in order to know what drivers you're running. That is your operating system's job in order to understand that, and that's where the translation comes in. Okay. If you, on the other hand, you had an AMD hard drive or or rather an AMD graphic card or an Intel graphic card and stuff like that, the same process will happen. Obviously, it will be the operating system which will actually pass on the information or the pertinent information to the drivers that are required. All right. So essentially, the operating system is acting as a bit of a go-between between the applications themselves and the hardware that they require in order to run the applications. Okay. So if we had to think about it, all right, the operating system is doing the abstraction, all right, of what the actual hardware is doing, all right, at the end of the day, both for the user's benefit in order to simplify it, as well as for the applications that are being run on it, all right. That's one part of the operating system's function. The other is to make sure that you are making use of your resources to their utmost, all right? And as well, you want to make sure that you're protecting your files and memory as much as possible, all right? Obviously, there are various different ways in which operating systems can actually do exactly what we've just described. All right. In fact, there are different operating systems that work in very different ways that we would like to take a look at together. We want to understand the different types of operating systems, be it batch, interactive, uniprogramming, multi-programming, real-time, multi-user, single-user, multitasking, single-tasking, distributed or embedded systems. All right. I know we don't have much time in order to go over these today, but we will be discussing this in our next lecture. All right. Trying to understand the different types of operating systems that currently exist. Note that even though over here we're talking about different types of operating systems, it is not always going to be the case that an operating system that you might be familiar with will fall under one category. Okay? So, for example, Windows 10 might fall under a number of different categories that we can see over here. All right, that's essentially the idea that we're going to be discussing in a moment. However, we still need to understand what these different terms mean, and we're going to go over that next week. All right, but before we call it a day, are there any questions from what we've actually discussed up to this point?
So far, so good.
Good. All right. I was just looking at the comments in the chat as well. All right. Cool. I don't want to keep you much longer. I know it's been a long day. Probably you're all hungry and you'd like to get some rest now, and we can do that. Thank you for listening, and I will see you guys next week.
Thank you, Jeremy.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye. Have a nice evening.
Ciao.
you. Bye-bye. Thank you.
Don't
Thank
forget
you.
to punch out, guys.
Yes, sir. Thank you.
All right.
Thank you for that.
Bye bye.